But this policy can be interpreted as justifying murder. Hi everyone, Aaron here, and welcome back to the channel. Today's question has to do with, does Scientology have a status that allows members to literally get away with murder? And this comes up, I think, because some former Scientologists have spoken about the fact that celebrities like John Travolta, for example, at one point, because of how much publicity John was getting for Scientology in the 80s and the 90s, he was awarded the status in Scientology of Kha-Khan. It's a status that L. Ron Hubbard created, a form of ethics protection based on something he claimed exists in an ancient army. And here's the description as given in Wikipedia, and this is accurate. It says, in 1965, Hubbard issued a policy letter entitled Ethics Protection. In it, he states that, quote, ethics actions are often used to handle down individual statistics. A person who is not doing his job becomes an ethics target, unquote, and goes on to detail how a Scientologist can protect himself from ethics punishments by being more productive and keeping statistics up. Quote, in short, a staff member can get away with murder so long as his statistic is up and can't sneeze without a chop if it's down, unquote. Now we can say without any shadow of a doubt that this is being used figuratively, the figurative use of to get away with murder. Okay, if the staff member's production is sufficiently high, as evidenced by an up statistic, the Scientologist gains an immunity to the ethics process, even if they have openly committed violations. When people do start reporting a staff member with a high statistic, what you investigate is the person who turned in the report. In an ancient army, a particularly brave deed was recognized by an award of the title of Kha-Khan. It was not a rank. The person remained what he was, but he was entitled to be forgiven the death penalty 10 times in case in the future he did anything wrong. That was a Kha-Khan. That's what producing high statistics staff members are. Kha-Khans. They can get away with murder without a blink from ethics, and ethics must recognize a Kha-Khan when it sees one and tear up the bad report chits on the person with a yawn. Now this is interesting because based on this policy, the status of Kha-Khan is not something that is officially bestowed. David Miscavige or L. Ron Hubbard doesn't have to make a public declaration of the fact. This policy is just talking about the fact that the ethics officer should treat people who have chronically high statistics, who are very high producers. They should treat those people the same way this ancient unspecified army treated people who had been awarded the status of Kha-Khan. Now, in John Travolta's case, I do believe there was a declaration, possibly from L. Ron Hubbard, but don't quote me on that, that he was officially recognizing John Travolta with this status, and that would have been something that was being done more for a ceremonial purpose, because like I said, according to the policy doesn't even make reference of officially declaring people a Kha-Khan. The policy just talks about treating people who have high statistics like they can get away with murder. And I think there's been a conflation between a couple things here. One, that L. Ron Hubbard is talking about this ancient army and he's saying that you can be forgiven the death penalty. Now in our society, you get the death penalty for committing murder. So being forgiven the death penalty is the same thing as being allowed to commit murder without consequences. And also, the only thing that's been misunderstood is whether it was literal or figurative. And I think at least the policy we're talking about here, it is without question figurative. However, there is another policy in Scientology that, depending on how you wanted to interpret it, it can definitely be interpreted as condoning committing murder. And that is the policy I'm here to talk about today. That policy is called responsibilities of leaders. In Scientology, it is also colloquially known as the third dynamic power formula. And the reason it's known as that is because at the end of this essay, LRH gives 7 steps for how people who have power, or people who work very closely to those who have power, 7 steps that they should follow in order to ensure success. And step number 6 specifically is where he gives advice for how those who work close to someone who has a lot of power should conduct themselves. And that is where things get particularly sinister. And the responsibilities of leaders is right up there with keeping Scientology working as one of the few most important policy letters in all of Scientology. I would argue that keeping Scientology working, the responsibilities of leaders, and another policy that is called the structure of organization, what is policy? These are 3 policies that are arguably the most important policies in all of Scientology. And since one of those three policies can be interpreted as condoning murder, I want to take you through that policy and show you which parts can be interpreted this way. But let's take a moment to talk about someone who's not out there condoning murder, and that is the sponsor of today's video, me. If you want to buy or sell a home anywhere in Tampa Bay and you would like to work with me, message me at aaron@dreamrealty.com. Okay, let's take a look at the responsibilities of leaders policy. This policy was included without any alterations in the book Introduction to Scientology Ethics. That's what I'm using as my source for this policy. The intro to this section in the ethics book says an essay on power. And then here we have responsibilities of leaders. We won't cover the whole thing, but I'm going to show you the most important parts. A few comments on power. Being or working close to or under a power, which is to say a leader or one who exerts wide primary influence on the affairs of men. I've written it this way using two actual people to give an example of magnitude enough to interest and to furnish some pleasant reading. And I used a military sphere so it could be seen clearly without re-stimulation of administrative problems. The mistakes of Simón Bolívar and Manuela Sáenz. Simón Bolívar was a liberator of South America from the yoke of Spain. Manuela Sáenz was the liberatress and consort. Their acts and fates are well recorded in this moving biography, but aside from any purely dramatic value, the book lays bare and motivates various actions of great interest to those who lead, who support, or are near leaders. Simón Bolívar was a very strong character. He had real personal ability, given to only a handful on the planet. He was a military commander without peer in history. What mistakes did he make? I cannot emphasize this enough. The whole thing is framed as a history lesson, provided so that Scientologists can learn from the mistakes these two very real people made so as not to repeat the same mistakes with L. Ron Hubbard. That is absolutely the purpose of this policy letter. So let's keep going here. Manuela Sáenz was a brilliant, beautiful, and able woman. She was loyal, devoted, quite comparable to Bolívar, far above the cut of average humanoids. That's common for LRH to speak that way. What mistakes did she make? The essay starts out with isolating what LRH believed to be Bolívar's errors. We're not going to focus on that part because that's not the part of the essay that's emphasized in Scientology. We're going to focus instead on what LRH said were the errors of Manuela Sáenz. All right, Manuela Sáenz. The tragedy of Manuela Sáenz as Bolívar's mistress was that she was never used, never really had a share, and was neither protected nor honored by Bolívar. We're going to skip around here. Her most fatal mistake was in not bringing down Santander, Bolívar's chief enemy. She knew for years Santander had to be killed, yet never did she promise some young officer a nice night or a handful of gold to do it in a day when dueling was in fashion. Her mistake was waiting to be asked to come to him to act. She guarded his correspondence, was intimate with his secretaries, and yet she never collected or forged or stole any documents to bring down enemies. She was not ruthless enough to make up for his lack of ruthlessness and not provident enough to make up for his lack of providence. Okay, we're jumping forward a bit more here. Man is too aberrated to understand at least 7 things about power. 1, life is lived by lots of people, and if you lead, you must either let them get on with it or lead them on with it actively. 2, when the game or the show is over, there must be a new game or a new show, and if there isn't, somebody else is jolly well going to start one. And if you won't let anyone do it, the game will become getting you. 3, if you have power, use it or delegate it, or you sure won't have it long. 4, when you have people, use them or they will soon become most unhappy and you won't have them anymore. 5, when you move off a point of power, pay all your obligations on the nail, empower all your friends completely, and move off with your pockets full of artillery, potential blackmail on every erstwhile rival, unlimited funds in your private account, and the addresses of experienced assassins, and go live in Belgravia and bribe the police. Abandoning power utterly is dangerous indeed. But we can't all be leaders or figures strutting in the limelight, so there's more to know about this. So here we get to step 6, and this is where LRH is telling someone who works close to a position of power how they should conduct themselves. He goes, when you're close to power, get some delegated to you, enough to do your job and protect yourself and your interests. So to live at all in the shadow or employ of a power, you must yourself gather and use enough power to hold your own. He doesn't have to know all the bad news. And if he's a power really, he won't ask all the time, what are those dead bodies doing at the door? And if you were clever, you never let it be thought he killed them. Well, boss, about all those dead bodies, nobody at all will suppose you did it. She over there, those pink legs sticking out, didn't like me. Well, he'll say, if he really is a power, why are you bothering me with it if it's done and you did it? Now, I want to point out something in this section. When it says here that he doesn't have to know all the bad news, and if he's a power really, he won't ask all the time, what are all those dead bodies doing at the door? So to Scientologists, this is LRH literally saying that an executive, when he sees evidence around him that something bad is happening, but it's a benefit to him, if he is a true power, he will not bother to inquire about the details. Now look, we can say that in present day Scientology, they're not literally talking about dead bodies because Scientologists aren't out there just literally murdering people and piling the bodies up at the door. But let's translate this into real life. You're David Miscavige. You know that in the Los Angeles org, they have been reporting astronomical gross income statistics for months and months and months on end. And you know from personal experience that no other org in the world has ever accomplished such statistics without just committing rampant financial fraud. You know this, and you see the evidence that this is happening again. But L. Ron Hubbard has said that if you're a really good, powerful executive, you won't ask, what are all those dead bodies piling up at the door? And if you're a good subordinate, you won't let him think he has anything to do with it. This is the literal real-world application of these historical examples and anecdotes in present-day Scientology. Miscavige is quite happy to sit back and reap the benefits of the astronomically high gross income statistics. This went on for months and years. Massive systemic credit card fraud occurring internationally in every Scientology organization around the world for years on end. This third dynamic power formula is directly responsible for how David Miscavige and everyone who works under him conducted themselves with respect to this massive systemic credit card fraud. To quote L. Ron Hubbard, "Why are you bothering me with this if it's done and you did it?" And that is exactly how Scientology landed in a hell of a lot of hot water. Financial fraud is much easier for the government to prosecute than other things that people have tried to prosecute Scientology for, like human trafficking, for example. Because Scientology has this aspect of religious protection from the government, it can be very hard for the courts to intervene and to determine what kind of activity is voluntary versus involuntary. But these credit card issues, these financial issues, these bank fraud issues, this is what the government's really good at. And how sweetly ironic it is that the way Scientology became so embroiled in it is by following LRH's instructions to the letter for how people in power should behave and how people who work close to power should behave. And to bring it back to what was the original subject of the video, which is how is this policy interpreted? How could this policy be interpreted to justify murder? And it's this example where he goes, well, boss, about all those dead bodies, nobody at all will suppose that you did it. She over there, those pink legs sticking out, she didn't like me. So the junior is doing the things he deems need to be done to protect the power source from his enemies. The junior does these things without bothering to burden the senior by asking permission, does them because he deems they need to be done, and then protects the senior by not sharing knowledge of what's been done with them. And this is L. Ron Hubbard's example, his anecdote of how the Scientology organization should operate. So do I think Scientologists or Sea Org members are out there literally committing murder? No, I don't. The evidence actually indicates otherwise. When you look at how much time and money Miscavige will spend to just sort of interfere with the lives of his enemies instead of making those enemies disappear, I think the evidence tends to indicate that Miscavige doesn't sanction murder, not because he thinks it's immoral. Miscavige probably sees, actually calling for hits on people as not a great risk reward in terms of retaining Scientology's tax-exempt status. But I hope you can see how this policy could be open to interpretation. And if someone did want to commit murder to help Miscavige or forward the aims of Scientology, this is the policy they would point to as the justification for it. And the last point here, it says, 7, it says, and lastly, the most important point, Always push power in the direction of anyone on whose power you depend. It may be more money for the power, or more ease, or a snarling defense of the power to a critic, or even the dull thud of one of his enemies in the dark, or the glorious blaze of the whole enemy camp as a birthday surprise. If Bolivar and Manuela had known these things, they would have lived an epic, not a tragedy. And this is what I mean when I say this isn't just allegory. L. Ron Hubbard is literally saying that if Simón Bolivar and Manuela Sáenz were Scientologists, and they understood Scientology, and they understood the third dynamic power formula and how to handle power and how to handle it when you work closely to someone with power, that as he has told this story would have been the proper way for them to conduct themselves, live their lives, secretly killing your boss's enemies without seeking permission first or sharing the information with him after the fact. And that is why this essay can be very confusing as far as what is it saying, in a moral sense. What is it literally saying? And also realize it sets up kind of a paradigm where if you're a true believer, you should go and do the things that you think need to be doing without asking for permission and without letting your boss know how you did it. And that as long as what you're doing, as long as you deem it to be for the greater good, that even if it's wrong or immoral or illegal, you should do it anyway. You shouldn't seek permission first, and you shouldn't really let anyone know that you did it. That is the actual accurate interpretation of this policy, whether we think anyone's out there committing murder or not. Which is why I say if someone were to be committing murder to forward the aims of Scientology or to protect David Miscavige, they would be correctly applying this policy. And that is really incredible to consider. So we started off talking about the Kha-Khan status. Any idea that Kha-Khan has anything to do with being able to commit murder, that's silly. That's not what it means. But this policy can be interpreted as justifying murder. And I guess I'll leave it to others to decide whether they think that's actually happening or not. All right, everyone, that's all I've got on this. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all of you who watched until the very end, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right